Story 1. The Frost Killer Story. It was the kind of cold that gnaws at your bones, the kind that makes you question whether warmth ever existed. The snow-covered streets of our small Alaskan town seemed peaceful enough at first glance, but beneath the pristine white surface lurked a terror that would haunt me forever. My name is Ethan Carter, and this is the story of how I survived, if you can call it that. The Frost Killer. It all began on a Monday night. The storm had rolled in with a vengeance, thick snowflakes falling like ash from a burning sky. The wind howled, rattling windows and doors, making it impossible to hear much of anything else. I was working the late shift at the diner, nursing a lukewarm coffee, while the last customer of the night, old man Hargrove, told me the same story he'd been telling for years about the bear that almost got him back in '68. It was comforting in a way, his rambling, familiar, ordinary. But then the door swung open and a gust of icy wind stole the warmth from the room. In walked Sheriff Daniels, his face pale and his eyes carrying a weight I'd never seen before. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and steady, "we've got a problem." The body was found just outside of town. A hunter named Cal Turner had stumbled across it while checking his traps. Sheriff Daniels didn't mince words. He said it was bad, worse than anything he'd ever seen. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go with him to the scene. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the way his voice wavered ever so slightly when he described the state of the victim. We drove out to the edge of the forest in silence, the only sound the crunch of tires on snow. The site was cordoned off with bright yellow tape, though no amount of caution could prepare me for what lay beyond it. The victim, a young woman in her 20s, was frozen solid, her body twisted in a grotesque pose as if she'd been trying to escape something or someone. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. The most unsettling part? Her hands were clutching a chunk of ice as though it had been handed to her moments before her death. "Cause of death?" I asked Sheriff Daniels, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Hypothermia," he replied grimly. "But it's more than that. The coroner says her body temperature dropped unnaturally fast, like something sucked the heat right out of her." The news spread quickly. In a town as small as ours, secrets were impossible to keep. People whispered about the Frost Killer, a name coined by the local paper. Some said it was a psychopath with a twisted sense of humor. Others believed it was something more supernatural. At first, I dismissed the latter as paranoia. After all, monsters weren't real, right? But then it happened again and again. Each victim found frozen in the same unnatural pose, clutching a chunk of ice that seemed almost out of place, as if it didn't belong in this world. The turning point came 1 week later. I was locking up the diner after another uneventful shift when I noticed something strange. A figure stood across the street, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then the figure moved, stepping closer, their outline sharp against the white backdrop. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound authoritative. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they reached into their coat and pulled out something small and glinting, a chunk of ice. My breath caught in my throat. Without thinking, I bolted for my truck. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to get the engine roaring just as the figure started toward me. I didn't look back as I sped off, the tires skidding on the icy road. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind against the windows made my heart race. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, wondering who or what that figure was. The next morning, I found something chilling on my doorstep, a perfectly sculpted ice figure in the shape of a hand. I went straight to Sheriff Daniels. He listened to my story with a furrowed brow, then showed me something that made my blood run cold. It was a map of the town, marked with red dots indicating where each victim had been found. The pattern wasn't random, it formed a spiral, with the diner and my house at its center. "You think I'm next?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think someone wants you to think that," Daniels replied. "But we're going to find them before they get the chance." We didn't have to wait long. That night, the power went out across the entire town. The temperature plummeted even further, and an unnatural silence blanketed the streets. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Daniels had stationed 2 deputies outside my house, but when I peeked out the window, they were gone. The only thing left was their flashlights, half buried in the snow. Then came the knocking. It was slow at first, almost tentative, but it grew louder and more insistent. I grabbed the shotgun from the closet and crept toward the door, my heart pounding like a drum. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just more knocking. Finally, I swung the door open, aiming the shotgun at nothing. The porch was empty, save for another ice figure, this one shaped like a face, its features twisted into a grotesque grin. And then, I felt it. The air grew impossibly cold, colder than it had any right to be. My breath froze in midair, falling to the ground in tiny crystals. And then I saw it, the figure from before, standing at the edge of the yard, holding that same chunk of ice. I fired the shotgun, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it moved closer, the snow around it melting and refreezing in its wake. Desperate, I slammed the door and barricaded it with whatever I could find. The knocking started again, more frantic this time, as if the figure knew I was trapped. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, I couldn't tell. Eventually, the knocking stopped and the air grew warmer. When I finally mustered the courage to look outside, the figure was gone. But the face-shaped ice sculpture remained, its frozen grin mocking me. The killing stopped after that night, but the fear never did. The town moved on, as small towns always do, but I couldn't. I left a few months later, unable to shake the feeling that the frost killer was still out there, watching, waiting. Even now, as I sit in this warm, crowded cafe thousands of miles away, I can't escape the chill. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear the knocking again. The end. Story 2. The Blizzard Butcher. It all started with a blizzard, a storm so fierce that it seemed to swallow the entire world in white. I was no stranger to harsh winters, having grown up in a small, remote town nestled in the Rocky Mountains. But this storm was different. It was relentless, merciless, and it brought with it something far worse than the cold. My name is Jake, and I had just taken over as the caretaker of the Aspen Ridge Lodge, a sprawling, isolated retreat popular with skiers and nature enthusiasts. The lodge had closed for the season, and I was tasked with preparing it for the coming spring. Alone. At least I thought I was alone. The first night of the storm, I sat by the fire, sipping whiskey and listening to the howling wind. Snow piled up against the windows, and the electricity had given out hours earlier. The only light came from the flickering flames and the lantern on the table. I felt a strange unease, like the shadows in the room were just a little too dark, the silence between the gusts of wind a little too deep. I dismissed it as cabin fever setting in early and turned in for the night. I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately identify, a dull, thudding noise that seemed to echo through the lodge. I grabbed the lantern and ventured into the dimly lit hallways, my breath visible in the freezing air. The sound grew louder as I approached the kitchen. My heart raced as I pushed open the door, only to find the back door swinging open, snow and wind gusting in. A shovel leaned against the wall nearby, its blade stained dark. An animal, I told myself, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I bolted the door, cleaned up the mess, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Something had gotten inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it might still be here. The next day, the blizzard raged on. I busied myself with chores to keep my mind occupied, but unease settled over me like a second skin. Around midday, I went outside to check the generator. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet, and the snow was up to my knees. As I approached the small shed where the generator was housed, I saw them. Footprints. They were human, leading away from the lodge and disappearing into the woods. "No one should be out here," I muttered, the words lost in the wind. My mind raced with possibilities, a lost hiker perhaps, or someone stranded by the storm, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The footprints weren't fresh, they were partially filled with snow, meaning whoever made them had been there for hours, watching. I followed the prints for a short distance before the storm made it impossible to continue. Turning back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The lodge loomed in the distance, its windows dark and foreboding. I'd never felt so small, so vulnerable. That night, the thudding returned. This time it came from the second floor. Clutching a flashlight and a heavy wrench, I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath my feet making my heart pound harder. The sound led me to one of the guest rooms. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if caught in a breeze, though there was no draft. Pushing it open, I shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, but the window was open, snow blowing in and pooling on the floor. On the bed lay a single, bloodied glove. My stomach churned as I stepped closer. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading to or from the window, just the glove and the faintest impression of a handprint on the frosted glass. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and searched the entire lodge from top to bottom. Every room, every closet, every dark corner. I found nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. It was as if the lodge itself was alive, breathing, its walls closing in around me. The third night was the worst. I didn't bother trying to sleep, instead sitting by the fire with the shotgun I'd found in the supply closet. Around midnight, the power flickered back on, only to go out again moments later. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched laughter carried on the wind. It sent chills down my spine, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I was terrified. I bolted the doors and windows, barricading myself in the main lounge. The laughter grew louder, joined by the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Peering through a crack in the curtains, I saw shadows moving in the blizzard. Dozens of them. They seemed to circle the lodge, their shapes distorted by the swirling snow. And then the lights came on again. The sudden brightness was blinding, and when my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Figures standing just outside the windows, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They wore old-fashioned clothes, tattered and stained, as if they'd been dragged from their graves. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't looking at me. They were looking past me. I spun around, the shotgun ready, but there was no one there. When I turned back to the windows, the figures were gone. The storm continued, the wind howling like a living thing, and I was left alone with the oppressive silence of the lodge. By morning, the storm had begun to ease. I ventured outside, desperate to leave, but the road was buried under several feet of snow. As I trudged back to the lodge, I noticed something sticking out of the snow near the generator shed. It was a boot, attached to a leg, attached to a body. The corpse was frozen solid, its face contorted in a look of sheer terror. Panicked, I stumbled back inside and called the sheriff. It took them hours to arrive, and by the time they did, the body was gone. All that remained was a patch of disturbed snow and a trail of bloody footprints leading back to the lodge. The investigation that followed uncovered a horrifying truth. Decades earlier, a group of guests had gone missing during a winter storm at the lodge. Their bodies were never found, but their presence lingered, haunting the place and anyone who dared to stay there alone. The locals called it the curse of the Blizzard Butcher, though no one could agree on who or what the butcher was. I left Aspen Ridge Lodge that day and never went back. The experience left me shaken, my nights plagued by nightmares of hollow-eyed figures and blood-stained snow. To this day, I don't know what I saw or if it was even real. But every winter when the first snow falls, I can't help but feel that same unease creeping in, as if the shadows in the snow are watching, waiting for their next victim. The end, Story 3, The Ice Cabin Mystery. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. I had booked a secluded cabin in the middle of a snowy forest to escape the chaos of my life. No phones, no emails, just me, the crackling fireplace, and the soft, enveloping silence of winter. Or so I thought. The drive up had been picturesque but unnerving. The snow fell in thick, swirling flakes, blanketing the winding road ahead. My car's tires crunched through the icy slush as skeletal trees loomed on either side. By the time I arrived, dusk had already descended, casting long, menacing shadows over the cabin. It stood alone, nestled against a frozen lake that gleamed like glass under the pale moonlight. The sight was breathtaking, but something about the stillness felt off. I shook the feeling away. I was here to unwind, not let my imagination run wild. The cabin was charming in its rustic simplicity, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and large windows overlooking the lake. After unpacking, I poured myself a glass of wine and sank into the couch, letting the warmth of the fire seep into my bones. Outside, the wind howled like a distant wail, and the snow tapped against the windowpane like impatient fingers. I convinced myself it was all part of the charm. Hours later, I woke with a start. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. My wine glass lay empty on the floor, and the clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. I had no memory of falling asleep, but what jarred me awake wasn't fatigue. It was the sound, a faint, deliberate knock at the door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who could be out here at this hour in the middle of nowhere? The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the cabin. My instinct screamed at me to stay put, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. My breath fogged the glass as I strained to see further, but there was no one there. Probably just the wind, I muttered, though my voice betrayed the doubt in my mind. As I turned back toward the living room, something caught my eye. On the frosted window pane near the door, there was a single handprint. Large, clear, and unmistakable. It hadn't been there earlier. My stomach churned. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and checked every corner of the cabin, but it was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, the unease lingered. I convinced myself it had all been a dream brought on by exhaustion and too much wine. To distract myself, I decided to explore the frozen lake. It stretched wide and endless, the ice thick enough to walk on. But as I stepped onto the surface, I noticed something peculiar. Deep grooves in the ice, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. They led from the edge of the forest to the center of the lake, where they disappeared beneath the surface. Curiosity tugged at me, but the biting cold forced me back to the cabin. As I warmed up with a cup of coffee, I couldn't stop thinking about those grooves. Were they from an animal, a sled? The questions gnawed at me, feeding my unease. That night I was determined to get a good night's sleep. I double-checked all the locks and kept the poker within arm's reach. But sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., the knocking returned. This time it was more insistent. 3 sharp raps that reverberated through the cabin. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The knocking stopped, but moments later, the sound of creaking floorboards filled the silence. It was coming from inside the cabin. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The creaking moved closer, slow and deliberate, until it stopped right outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever, or whatever, was on the other side could hear it. Then, silence. Minutes passed like hours before I mustered the courage to turn on the light and open the door. No one was there, but the wooden floor was damp, leaving a trail of wet footprints leading back to the front door. My hands trembled as I followed them. The door was locked just as I had left it, but the footprints, they ended abruptly in the middle of the living room, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn broke, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bags and loaded them into the car, ready to leave this nightmare behind. But as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but the car wouldn't start. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. Desperate, I decided to walk to the nearest town. The snow was falling heavier now, and the cold bit through my layers as I trudged through the forest. But the further I walked, the more disoriented I became. The trees all looked the same, and there was no sign of the road. It was as if the forest was shifting around me, trapping me in its icy grip. Then I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing motionless among the trees. They were dressed in a tattered coat, their face obscured by the falling snow. Relief flooded through me. "Hey!" I called out, waving my arms. "I need help!" The figure didn't move. Unease crept back into my chest as I approached. "Excuse me, do you know the way to the road?" I asked. Still no response. I was only a few feet away now, and that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't human. It was a crude scarecrow, its head a burlap sack stitched with a grotesque, leering face. Its hands were skeletal branches, and its body was stuffed with snow and straw. But what chilled me to the core was the message carved into its chest. Leave. I stumbled back, my breath coming in panicked gasps. When I turned to run, I saw another scarecrow, then another. They surrounded me, each one identical, their hollow eyes seeming to watch my every move. I ran blindly, crashing through the trees until I finally saw the cabin ahead. Relief was short-lived. The front door was wide open, swinging on its hinges, and inside, the cabin was unrecognizable. The furniture was overturned, the walls scratched with deep gouges. The windows were shattered, letting the snow pile inside. On the floor, written in what looked like blood, was a single word. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing behind me, slow, deliberate, and chillingly close. I turned, gripping the poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. But there was no one there, just the empty, snow-covered forest. I don't remember much after that. Somehow I made it through the night, barricading myself in the bedroom. When morning came, the storm had cleared, and my car miraculously started on the first try. I didn't question it. I just drove, the cabin and its horrors shrinking in my rearview mirror. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the experience. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and every knock at the door sent me into a panic. I decided to do some research, hoping to make sense of what had happened. What I found only deepened my terror. Years ago, a family had rented that same cabin during a harsh winter. They were found frozen to death in the middle of the lake, their bodies arranged in a grotesque circle. The cause of death was never determined, and the case remained unsolved. Locals whispered about a curse, about something that lived in the forest and lured its victims to the cabin. I don't know what I encountered during those 3 nights, but one thing is certain. Something in that cabin wanted me to stay, and it wasn't going to let me leave alive. To this day, I can still hear the knocking in my dreams, and I'm haunted by a question I'll never answer. What would have happened if I'd opened the door? If you ever find yourself alone in a remote cabin, far from civilization, remember this. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and if you hear a knock in the dead of night, don't answer it. You might not like what's waiting on the other side. The end. Story 4. The Snowman Murders. It started with the snowman. I remember that morning vividly. The sharp, icy air that burned my lungs, the muffled silence of the freshly fallen snow, and the sight of that snowman staring at my front porch. Its blank, coal-black eyes seemed to follow me as I walked down the steps, a smile carved too wide for comfort. It wasn't mine. I hadn't built it, and I lived alone. I should have destroyed it right then and there, but instead, I dismissed it as a prank by some neighborhood kids. Little did I know, it was the start of something that would haunt me forever. 2 days before Christmas, our small town was buried in snow, transforming it into a picture-perfect winter wonderland. The holiday spirit was everywhere. Twinkling lights, carolers, and the smell of spiced cider wafting through the air. It felt like a scene from a movie. But underneath the cheer, there was a subtle unease. A woman had gone missing the night before. Emily Harper, a local librarian. She was last seen leaving work, and her car was found abandoned near the edge of town. Her disappearance was the third in as many weeks. By the time I got to the office, I work as a reporter for the town paper. The newsroom was buzzing. People were speculating everything from an animal attack to a serial killer, though most leaned toward the former. After all, nothing bad ever happened in Frost Hollow. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. or at least we thought we did. The editor, Greg, handed me the Harper case to investigate. "Keep it straightforward," he said. "No wild theories. Stick to the facts." "Got it," I replied, though the thrill of a mystery was already taking hold of me. I decided to start with the scene where her car had been found. The spot was desolate, just a stretch of road flanked by towering pines. Snow blanketed everything, and the only sound was the occasional creak of branches under the weight of ice. Her car was gone, towed earlier that morning, but the eerie emptiness of the area lingered. As I scanned the surroundings, my eyes caught something unusual: a snowman, perfectly shaped and standing eerily close to the tree line. I moved closer. It wasn't particularly large, just the standard three-tiered kind, but something about it felt off. The coal eyes weren't evenly spaced, and the stick arms were twisted unnaturally. The carrot nose jutted out at an odd angle, almost like it had been forced in with too much aggression. And then there was the scarf, a vibrant red fluttering lightly in the breeze. It was the only splash of color against the stark white landscape. Emily Harper had been wearing a red scarf the night she disappeared. A chill crept up my spine, and not from the cold. I backed away, my breath coming in short, visible puffs. When I returned to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. That night, sleep was elusive. My mind raced with questions. Was the snowman connected to Emily? And if so, how? By 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and started digging through old police reports. That's when I stumbled upon something chilling. 20 years ago, Frost Hollow had been plagued by a series of disappearances during the winter months. 5 people vanished over a span of 6 weeks. The only common thread? Snowmen found near each crime scene, each one decorated with an item belonging to the victim. The case was never solved, and the town's collective memory had buried it along with the snow. My hands trembled as I closed the file. The snowmen. Could it be happening again? The next morning, I decided to visit Margaret Lane, the town historian. If anyone knew more about the old case, it would be her. Margaret lived in a creaky Victorian house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by bare, skeletal trees. She greeted me with a wary smile, ushering me into a cluttered study filled with dusty books and faded photographs. When I mentioned the snowmen, her expression darkened. "So it's happening again," she murmured, almost to herself. "You knew about this?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. She nodded. "They called him the Snowman Killer. Whoever it was, they were meticulous. The snowmen were always perfectly crafted, almost artistic, and each one," her voice faltered, "each one seemed to mock the victim's fate." "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated before continuing. "One of the victims, a young man named Peter, was found frozen in a block of ice near the river. The snowman near his house had icicles for fingers. Another victim, a schoolteacher, was strangled with her own scarf. The snowman at her door had a scarf tied tightly around its neck." My stomach churned. Why wasn't this in the police reports? "The town covered it up," she said bitterly. "They didn't want Frost Hollow to become infamous for something so gruesome, but the killer was never caught." As I left Margaret's house, the weight of her words pressed heavily on me. If the snowman killer had returned, no one in Frost Hollow was safe. That evening, the snow started again, thick flakes falling in a hypnotic dance. I stayed up late, piecing together the connections between the past and present disappearances. At around midnight, I heard it, a faint crunching sound like footsteps on snow. My heart raced as I peeked out the window. There it was, another snowman standing in my yard, closer this time. Its smile was more grotesque, carved deep into its face, and its coal eyes glinted ominously in the moonlight. But what froze me in place was the object clutched in its stick hand, a pair of glasses. I recognized them immediately. They belonged to Emily Harper. I locked every door and window, double-checking each one like a paranoid maniac. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a prelude to something terrible. By morning, the snowman was gone, leaving only a disturbed patch of snow where it had stood. I reported the incident to the police, but they dismissed it as a prank. Frustrated and terrified, I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I staked out my front porch, waiting for whoever, or whatever, was behind this. Hours passed, and the cold seeped into my bones. Just as I was about to give up, I saw movement near the tree line. A shadowy figure emerged, dragging something heavy. My breath caught as I realized what it was, another snowman. I waited until the figure was halfway across the yard before springing into action. I charged, my bat raised high. The figure dropped the snowman and bolted, disappearing into the woods. I didn't dare follow. Instead, I turned my attention to the snowman. This one was different. Its head was tilted unnaturally, and its mouth was twisted into a grimace. Around its neck was a red scarf, the same one I had seen before, and embedded in its chest was a knife, the handle sticking out like a grotesque parody of a heart. I called the police again, and this time, they couldn't ignore the evidence. Officers swarmed the area, but their search of the woods turned up nothing. They told me to stay inside and keep my doors locked. It was little comfort. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. The next few days were a blur. Another person went missing, a teenager named Kyle. His parents found a snowman in their yard with a tattered baseball cap perched on its head. The town was in a frenzy, and curfews were enforced. But no amount of precautions seemed to matter. The snowman kept appearing, each one more sinister than the last. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. I woke to find a snowman blocking my front door. This one was monstrous, nearly 7 feet tall, with jagged sticks for arms and a gaping mouth filled with broken glass. Propped against it was a sign scrawled in blood-red paint, "You're next." I fled the house, not caring where I went as long as it was far from Frost Hollow. But the image of that snowman haunts me still. The snowman killer was never caught, and the disappearances remain unsolved. Every winter when the first snow falls, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see those coal black eyes staring back at me, because deep down, I know he's still out there waiting. The end. Story 5. The Cry of the Ice Maiden. They say the cold has a voice. Sometimes it whispers, other times it screams. The first time I heard her, the Ice Maiden, I thought it was just the wind, a mournful howl through the snow-covered trees. But then I heard it again, clear as a bell, a woman's sob, carried on the icy air. It wasn't my imagination. I wish it had been. My name is Alex, and I'm a documentary filmmaker. Last winter, I was sent to a remote village in Siberia to film a piece on disappearing communities. The village, Cheka, had been nearly abandoned, save for a few hardy souls who refused to leave their ancestral homes despite the encroaching desolation and the brutal winters. The villagers spoke of ancient legends, of spirits that haunted the frost-bitten land. I'd dismissed their stories as folklore. Now I wish I hadn't. It began on the third night. The temperature had plummeted to an unimaginable low, and the wind howled outside my cabin like a feral beast. My breath misted in the frigid air, even indoors. I was reviewing the footage from the day when I heard it, a distant, piercing cry. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was sharper, more chilling, as if the sound itself could freeze you in place. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, thinking someone might be in trouble. Stepping outside, I was hit by an unforgiving gust of wind. The snow sparkled under the full moon, and the forest loomed dark and menacing in the distance. The sound came again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response, only the crunch of snow beneath my boots as I moved toward the forest edge. The villagers had warned me not to wander after dark. "The spirits walk at night," old Yelena had said, her rheumy eyes darting toward the woods. "Especially the Ice Maiden. She mourns her lost soul." I'd laughed it off then. Now, standing alone in the freezing darkness, her words echoed in my mind. The cry came again, louder, almost desperate. My flashlight beam wavered as I scanned the trees. Then I saw her. A figure, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood motionless among the trees. She wore a flowing white dress, utterly incongruous against the deadly cold. Her hair, long and dark, whipped around her face. She looked fragile, almost translucent, like she might shatter if touched. "Are you okay?" I called, taking a cautious step forward. She didn't move. My pulse quickened. Something about her was profoundly wrong. The air grew colder with each step I took. the kind of cold that bites deep into your bones. When I was just a few feet away, she turned her head slowly, and I saw her face. Her eyes were hollow sockets, black as the void. Her mouth opened wide, unnaturally so, and the scream that erupted was deafening. It wasn't a human scream, it was a sound that carried centuries of anguish and despair. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling from my grasp. The beam spun wildly, illuminating flashes of snow and shadow. When I looked up again, she was gone. I don't remember how I made it back to the cabin. My hands were numb and my lungs burned from the cold. I bolted the door and collapsed onto the bed, my heart racing. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sounded like her cry. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and the extreme cold. But the footage told a different story. The camera I'd been wearing that night had captured everything. The figure in the woods, her hollow eyes, her unnatural scream, all of it. I played the clip over and over, each viewing eroding my skepticism. This wasn't a hallucination. She was real, and she was haunting me. The villagers weren't surprised when I told them. They simply nodded grimly and crossed themselves. Yelena pulled me aside and whispered, "You've seen her now. She won't let you go." I tried to press her for details, but she refused to say more. Another villager, a middle-aged man named Sergei, finally relented. "The Ice Maiden was a real woman," he said, his voice low. "Centuries ago, she was accused of witchcraft and banished into the forest during a harsh winter. She froze to death, cursing the villagers with her dying breath. Since then, she's been searching for someone to take her place." "Take her place?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Sergei's face was grave. "Her spirit cannot rest. She seeks to trade her torment for another's soul." I wanted to leave Cheka immediately, but the snowstorm had worsened, making travel impossible. I was trapped. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of her in the corner of my eye, always just out of reach. Her cries grew louder, more insistent. The cold in my cabin became unbearable, even with the fire roaring. One night I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed. Her hollow eyes bore into mine, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then she reached out, her icy fingers brushing my cheek. Pain seared through me, like frostbite spreading across my skin. I screamed and scrambled backward, but she vanished before my eyes. Desperation drove me to Yelena's door. "Please," I begged. "How do I stop her?" Yelena hesitated before handing me a small, worn book. "This is all we know," she said. "But be warned, confronting her is dangerous. Many have tried, none have succeeded." The book was filled with ancient rituals and symbols, most of which I couldn't decipher. One passage, however, stood out. "To banish the Ice Maiden, one must return her to the place of her death and light a fire of sacred wood. But beware, she will fight to keep her hold." Armed with the book and a desperate determination, I set out for the forest. The villagers had told me where she died, a clearing deep in the woods. The trek was harrowing. The cold seemed almost alive, clawing at my skin and sapping my strength. Her cries echoed around me, growing louder as I neared the clearing. When I arrived, the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The ground was covered in frost, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I gathered the wood Yelena had given me and lit the fire. The flames sputtered and hissed as if the cold itself were fighting back. Then she appeared. She was more solid now, more terrifying. Her eyes burned with malevolence, and her scream was a physical force pushing me back. "You cannot take this from me!" she hissed, her voice like shattering ice. She lunged at me, her icy hands clawing at my throat. Pain exploded in my chest as the cold seeped into my very bones. With the last of my strength, I threw the book into the fire. The flames roared to life, engulfing her. Her screams turned into a wail of despair as her form dissolved into the smoke. Then, silence. I stumbled back to the village, barely alive. The storm had passed, and the air felt warmer, almost gentle. The villagers greeted me with a mixture of relief and awe. "You did it," Yelena said, tears in her eyes. "You freed us." But I wasn't so sure. Even now, months later, I sometimes hear her cry in the wind, and when the nights are coldest, I feel her icy fingers brushing against my skin, a chilling reminder that some spirits never truly rest. The end. Story 6. The Ski Lodge Slasher. I don't even know where to start. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there, in that ski lodge, surrounded by the snow, the silence, and the screams that tore through the night. If I'd known how that weekend would end, I never would have gone, but we didn't know. None of us did. It all started with an invitation. My best friend Emma had booked a trip to a remote ski lodge up in the Rockies for the 6 of us. "It'll be a blast," she'd said. "No distractions, no crowds, just us and the snow." I wasn't much of a skier, but the idea of a weekend getaway with my friends sounded perfect. The lodge was beautiful, a rustic, sprawling cabin surrounded by miles of pristine white snow. It was tucked so far into the mountains that we had to take a snowcat to reach it. Inside, there was a roaring fireplace, plush sofas, and huge windows offering breathtaking views of the snow-covered peaks. It was perfect, too perfect. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, cracked open a few beers, and joked around like we always did. The lodge's caretaker, a grizzled old man named Victor, gave us a quick tour before heading back down the mountain. He seemed off. He kept glancing out the windows and muttering about the storm rolling in. "Don't wander off," he'd warned. "Storms up here can turn deadly fast." We brushed it off. Victor was probably just trying to scare the city kids. We were young, invincible, and ready for a weekend of fun. That night, the storm hit. Heavy snow pelted the lodge, and the wind howled like a living thing. We lit a fire, played some board games, and laughed about how we were living in a real-life winter wonderland. It wasn't until we went to bed that I felt it, that nagging sense that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way the wind sounded, almost like a voice whispering through the cracks in the walls. Or maybe it was the shadows that seemed to flicker just out of sight. I told myself I was imagining things and went to sleep. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Emma's boyfriend, Jake, was missing. We'd all stayed up late, so we assumed he'd just slept in. But when we knocked on his door, there was no answer. His bed was neatly made, and his boots were gone. "Maybe he went for an early run on the slopes," Emma said, though she didn't look convinced. Jake wasn't exactly a morning person. We split up to look for him, trudging through the snow in pairs. The storm had left a thick blanket of powder, and it wasn't long before we realized we couldn't see any fresh tracks leading away from the lodge. It was as if Jake had vanished into thin air. By noon, panic had set in. We searched every inch of the lodge and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. That's when we decided to call for help. But the radio, our only means of communication with the outside world, was dead. No signal, no power. We were completely cut off. "We need to stay calm," Emma said, though her voice was shaking. "Maybe Victor will come back to check on us." But he didn't. The day dragged on, the storm picked up again, and the lodge's once cozy atmosphere began to feel suffocating. By nightfall, we'd all gathered in the main room, too scared to be alone. That's when we heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the window. We all froze, our eyes snapping to the glass. Outside, the snow was falling heavily, but there was something else. A shape, a figure standing just beyond the light of the lodge. "Jake?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. She rushed to the window, but by the time she got there, the figure was gone. The snow beneath the window was undisturbed. No footprints, nothing. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind or a trick of the light, but deep down, we all knew better. Something was out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the wind howl and the creaks of the old lodge. Every little noise set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. That tapping. But this time, it was at my window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in bed, pull the covers over my head, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity won out. Slowly, I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just snow and darkness. I let out a shaky breath and turned back toward my bed, and that's when I saw it. a shadowy figure standing in the corner of my room. I screamed, and the figure vanished as the others came rushing in. They found me huddled in the corner, shaking and crying, but there was no sign of anyone else. "You must have had a nightmare," Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. The next day we found Jake, or what was left of him. He was sprawled in the snow just outside the lodge, his body frozen solid. His face was twisted in a grotesque expression of terror, and his chest had been torn open as if by some massive clawed hand. But there were no tracks, no blood, just Jake's lifeless body in the pristine, undisturbed snow. Panic turned to chaos. We barricaded the doors and windows, huddling together in the main room with whatever weapons we could find. A fire poker, a kitchen knife, a broken chair leg. But the lodge felt different now. The warmth was gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill that no amount of fire could chase away. That night, the power went out. The fireplace provided the only light, casting flickering shadows on the walls. We took turns keeping watch, but it didn't matter. One by one, my friends disappeared. First Emma, then Ryan, then the others. Each time, we'd hear a noise, a soft thud, a creak of the floorboards, and when we turned around, someone would be gone. No screams, no struggle, just gone. By the fourth night, it was just me, alone in the lodge, surrounded by silence and the suffocating darkness. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer and closer. I grabbed the fire poker and pressed myself into the corner, my eyes darting around the room. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a voice, low and guttural, whispered my name. "Who's there?" I screamed, my voice cracking. But there was no answer, just the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. And then I saw it. The shadowy figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with glowing red eyes and a twisted, almost human face. It took a step closer, and I swung the fire poker with all my strength. The figure vanished, and I collapsed to the floor, sobbing. When I finally looked up, the room was empty, but the sense of dread lingered, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I don't know how I survived the night. When morning came, I stumbled out of the lodge and into the snow, desperate to escape. Somehow I made it to the nearest town, though I don't remember how. The authorities found the lodge empty, with no sign of my friends or the thing that had hunted us. They called me delusional, said the isolation and the storm had driven me mad. But I know the truth. Something was in that lodge, something ancient, malevolent, and hungry. And it's still out there, waiting for its next victims. So if you ever find yourself in a remote ski lodge, surrounded by snow and silence, remember this: don't look out the windows, don't go outside, and whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers in the dark. The end. Story 7. The Silent Lake. It's been 10 years since that night on the frozen shores of Silent Lake, but I still wake up drenched in sweat, haunted by the sounds of ice cracking beneath my boots and the sight of what we found beneath the surface. They say some places have memories, that they hold on to the echoes of what's happened there. Silent Lake is one of those places. The trip started innocently enough. My two friends, Ethan and Sam, and I decided to escape the chaos of the city for a weekend of ice fishing. It was Ethan's idea. He had heard about the lake from a coworker who claimed it was untouched, remote, and surrounded by breathtaking winter landscapes. A place where the fish were so plentiful they practically leapt onto your line. What he didn't mention was the history, the rumors of disappearances, the whispered warnings from locals about staying off the ice after dark. We brushed off their hushed words as mere superstition, eager for adventure. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, laughter, and a bit of peace away from the world. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sky heavy with thick gray clouds that promised a snowstorm. Silent Lake was exactly as described, pristine and eerily beautiful. The surface was a smooth expanse of ice, its pale blue glow reflecting the dim light of the setting sun. Tall, skeletal trees encircled the shoreline, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The air was so cold it burned with every breath, Ethan was the first to step onto the ice, laughing as he skidded across the surface. Sam and I followed cautiously, testing the thickness with our boots. The ice groaned under our weight, a low, mournful sound that set my nerves on edge. But Ethan waved us off, assuring us it was safe. We set up camp on the shore, a small tent to shield us from the biting wind and a portable heater to keep us warm through the night. As darkness fell, we lit a fire and shared stories, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the frozen lake. It felt like we were the only people in the world, surrounded by an infinite snow-covered wilderness. But the longer I stared at the lake, the more unsettled I became. It was too quiet. No sounds of wildlife, no wind rustling the trees, just silence. "You're being paranoid," Ethan said when I mentioned it. "It's just the winter. Everything's hibernating." But Sam didn't laugh. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he'd heard something I hadn't. "Maybe we should stick close to the shore," he said, "just in case." That night I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. At first I thought it was one of the guys, but when I looked over, both were still in their sleeping bags, breathing deeply. I grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent, the cold air biting at my face. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to illuminate the footprints leading away from the tent, onto the ice. "Guys, wake up!" I hissed, my voice shaking. "Someone's out there!" Ethan groaned, pulling the sleeping bag over his head, but Sam was already sitting up, his eyes wide. "Are you sure?" he whispered. I didn't answer. Instead, I pointed the flashlight toward the lake, following the trail of prints. They stopped abruptly about 20 feet from the shore, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. But that wasn't the worst part. The ice beneath the footprints was darker, almost black, as if something had seeped up from below. The next morning, we tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. Maybe the ice was melting, or we'd imagined the whole thing. But when we returned to the spot, the footprints were still there, the black ice gleaming under the pale sunlight. Ethan insisted we go fishing anyway, determined not to let a little weirdness ruin the trip. Reluctantly, we agreed. We drilled our holes in the ice, set up our lines, and waited. Hours passed with no bites. The wind picked up, carrying with it an eerie, howling sound that seemed to come from deep within the lake. Ethan laughed it off, calling it lake music, but Sam and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something wasn't right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple, Sam's line jerked violently. He grinned, reeling it in with effort, but when he pulled the line free, his smile vanished. Instead of a fish, he'd hooked a piece of cloth, faded, tattered, and stained with something dark. It looked old, like it had been underwater for years. "Let's pack up," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't normal." But Ethan shook his head. "It's just some garbage. People litter all the time. You're overreacting." He cast his line again, determined to prove us wrong. That's when we heard it. A deep, resonant crack echoed across the lake, followed by a series of smaller, sharper sounds. The ice beneath us began to shift and groan, as if something massive was moving below. We scrambled to our feet, abandoning our gear. "Run!" I shouted. But before we could reach the shore, the ice gave way beneath Ethan. He screamed as he plunged into the freezing water, his arms flailing as he tried to grab onto the edge of the ice. Sam and I dropped to our knees, reaching for him, but the current was too strong. He was pulled under in seconds, his terrified face disappearing into the depths. We stood there, frozen in shock, staring at the black water where Ethan had been. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the water began to bubble. A shape emerged from the hole, pale, bloated, and horribly human. It was a face, but not Ethan's. The eyes were wide and vacant, the mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and then it sank back beneath the surface, leaving only ripples behind. We ran. I don't remember how we made it back to the shore, only that we didn't stop until we were inside the tent, huddled together in terror. We didn't sleep that night, jumping at every sound, every creak of the ice. When dawn finally broke, we packed up what we could carry and left, leaving Ethan's gear behind. We reported his disappearance to the authorities, but they found no trace of him. The official story was that he drowned, that the cold and the current had taken his body too far to recover. But Sam and I knew the truth. Something was in that lake, something ancient and evil, and it wasn't done. 2 weeks later, Sam was found dead in his apartment. The cause of death was listed as hypothermia, but the coroner couldn't explain how his body had frozen solid in a heated building. They also couldn't explain the waterlogged footprints leading from his bed to his front door. I've spent the last decade running, moving from city to city, never staying in one place for too long. But no matter where I go, I can't escape the sound of cracking ice or the feeling that I'm being watched. Silent Lake took my friends, and it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. If you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow and silence, and you see a lake that seems too perfect, too still, turn around. Don't stop. Don't look back, because some places remember and some places hunger, and Silent Lake is always waiting. The end. Story 8. The Midnight Sled. It started with a chilling howl, echoing through the trees as if the very wind had become a living thing. A scream that sounded so close I thought I was hearing it from inside my own head. But when I opened the door, the snow was still falling, silent as death. That night, everything changed. The night was the kind that wraps its cold fingers around your bones and never lets go. I had been staying at my friend Evan's family cabin for the weekend, tucked away in the mountains, isolated from the rest of the world. A perfect getaway from everything, or so I thought. It was meant to be a break, just a few days away from the chaos of life, but the place had an aura I couldn't shake off. Something wasn't right, even before the sled appeared. There had been stories about the cabin. Local legends told of strange happenings around the forest, of people vanishing in the snow. Most of it was dismissed as superstition, but I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread whenever I stepped out into the woods. Yet none of that could prepare me for what would come next. It was just past midnight when I first heard it, the soft, eerie squeak of a sled gliding through the snow. I froze, lying in bed, listening intently. I assumed it was Evan, messing around outside in the snow, or maybe one of the other guests, but no one had mentioned going outside. I was about to roll over when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint voice, distant yet clear. "Help me." The voice sent shivers down my spine. It was so faint but unmistakable. My mind raced as I tried to reason with myself. It could have been the wind. It had to have been the wind. But then I heard it again, louder this time, the voice breaking through the night like a scream frozen in time. "Help me, please!" My instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but curiosity, or maybe something darker, pushed me to the door. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound in the vast silence. The night was heavy with a blanket of fresh snow, and the world felt oddly still. Too still. That's when I saw it. The sled. It sat at the edge of the woods slick with ice and snow, a stark contrast to the otherwise untouched white landscape. But what caught my attention more than the sled itself was the figure standing beside it. A girl, pale as the snow, her long, tangled hair cascading over her shoulders. She was staring at me, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were hollow, black, like they had been sucked into some unfathomable abyss. Before I could move, she spoke again, her voice raspy and pained. "Get on the sled!" I could feel my heart thundering in my chest, my breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. I wanted to scream, to run back into the warmth of the cabin, but something held me in place. The sled, her words, the strange pull in the air, everything about it felt wrong. I don't know why I obeyed, but I did. The girl didn't move, her hollow eyes never leaving mine, as if she was waiting for me to make the next move. Slowly, as though in a trance, I approached the sled. It was old, ancient even, with carvings on the wood that I couldn't quite make out. As I placed my hand on the handle, a cold shock ran through me, like touching something frozen from the inside out. Before I could pull away, a jolt of energy shot through my body, and in that instant I was no longer standing outside the cabin. The world shifted violently, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting on the sled, gliding through the snow at a terrifying speed. The snow around me blurred into a chaotic whirl of white and gray. Panic rose within me, but it was as though my body refused to respond. I tried to scream, to make sense of what was happening, but no sound escaped my lips. All I could do was watch as the snowstorm raged on, the trees flying past me, their twisted skeletal branches reaching out like fingers. I couldn't understand how it was happening, or why. Then I saw it. At the edge of the forest, through the flurry of snow, there was something moving, something enormous. A dark shape blotting out the stars. It was fast, impossibly fast, and it was coming straight at me. Fear, pure and raw, clawed its way up my throat. I could hear a low, guttural growl growing louder, and I knew deep down that I was being hunted. The sled began to slow, and I was thrown violently to the ground. The snow felt too soft beneath me, like a blanket ready to swallow me whole. I stumbled to my feet, the cold air stinging my skin as I turned to face the creature. No, the thing that had been chasing me. It was humanoid, but twisted, its limbs unnaturally long and gnarled. Its face was a mask of frost, with hollow, empty eyes and jagged teeth that gleamed like ice. It moved with an unsettling grace, almost like it was floating, and as it drew closer, I could hear the unmistakable sound of the sled's runners grinding through the snow behind me. A voice, chilling and deep, echoed in my mind. "She is mine." I didn't have time to process the words before the creature lunged, and I barely managed to dodge, falling into the snow with a terrified gasp. It circled me like a predator, its eyes burning with malevolent intent. The girl's voice echoed again, this time louder. "Get on the sled!" But there was no sled in sight, only the creature and the snow. I ran. I don't remember how long I ran, only that my legs burned, my chest heaving with each desperate breath. The creature was still behind me, its growls reverberating in the frozen air. Every time I thought I could escape, it was right there, closer, faster than I could comprehend. The wind howled and the snow fell heavier, blinding me with its icy grip. Just as I thought I was done for, the snow parted before me, revealing the cabin, my only hope. With the last of my strength, I stumbled towards the door and yanked it open, slamming it behind me. I was inside. The world outside was still, deathly silent, and for a moment I thought I might be safe. But when I turned to lock the door, I saw it, the sled. It was sitting in the middle of the room, untouched, waiting for me. And then I heard it, the voice, the girl's voice, from outside the door, whispering in the cold. "You can't leave. You're already mine." I don't know what happened that night, or how I ended up back in the cabin the next morning. The snow had stopped, the world still and quiet as if nothing had ever occurred. But when I looked at my hands, I saw the frostbite, deep and raw, and my breath trembled as I realized I was never supposed to escape. The sled waits for its next rider, and no one ever truly leaves. The end. Story 9. The Winter Carnival Massacre. The sound of laughter and music was drowned out by the screams. I'll never forget the night the Winter Carnival turned into a living nightmare. It should have been a night of joy, of families gathered around bonfires, children skating on the frozen lake, and couples enjoying the sparkling lights in the snow. But it ended in blood, chaos, and horror. I was there. I saw it all. And now, every year when the first snow falls, the nightmares come rushing back. I can still hear those screams. It started off so normally. My friends and I were in the small mountain town of Ashford for the annual Winter Carnival. It was an event that brought everyone together, filling the town square with laughter, lights, and carnival rides. The chill in the air was sharp, but we were all wrapped in scarves and coats, our breath turning to mist as we wandered from one stall to the next, sipping on hot chocolate and warming our hands by the fire. I remember the first moment the night took a strange turn. It was around 9 p.m., and the festival was at its peak. The Ferris wheel, towering over the square, had just begun to spin, its lights flickering like distant stars. The smell of freshly baked gingerbread cookies and roasted chestnuts filled the air. People were everywhere, all wrapped in winter gear, walking from the ice rink to the food stalls, laughing and chatting. But then the first scream came. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint, piercing cry that cut through the noise. A woman, standing near the ice rink, had clutched her throat before collapsing to the snow. Her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. It was strange. No one knew what had happened. At first, everyone assumed she had fainted or suffered a panic attack. People gathered around her and a few rushed to get help, but the terror had already begun to spread. No one could have known that she was the first victim. As the crowd gathered, someone noticed the blood. A crimson trail was slowly spreading across the snow beneath her. The woman wasn't fainting, she was dying. The carnival's music seemed to fade into the background as whispers ran through the crowd. I remember my heart racing, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a cruel trick. This was supposed to be a night of celebration, not death, but that scream had shattered the illusion. I was with my friends at the time. We were standing near the Ferris wheel, enjoying the view of the lit-up town. My best friend Sarah was the first to suggest that we check it out. The police were already on the scene, but no one had answers yet. As we pushed our way through the crowd, we heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder and more frantic. By the time we reached the body, things had gotten worse. The woman was surrounded by paramedics, but her body had already gone cold. A chill deeper than the night seemed to settle over the square, and I felt it then, the first wave of dread. But that wasn't the worst of it, not by far. As we tried to leave the scene, the crowd was suddenly thrown into disarray. A series of loud bangs echoed across the square. At first I thought it was fireworks, part of the carnival show, but no. The sound of gunshots rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal striking flesh. Chaos erupted. People screamed, children cried. The carnival rides, once full of laughter, now became places of terror. The Ferris wheel had stopped, but from above we could see the figures running. Figures in dark clothing, their faces hidden by masks, their eyes glinting with something cold and unfeeling. Someone had opened fire, and they weren't stopping. Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the crowd, but it was too late. People were everywhere, trampling each other, running in all directions, trying to escape the violence that had descended upon the carnival. I don't know how we ended up near the old wooden booth selling scarves, but I remember the cold feeling of the snow beneath my feet as I realized that no one was safe. I'm not proud of how we reacted next. Fear, pure and simple, drove us. We ran. We didn't know who was doing this or why, but we were caught in the madness. It was a nightmare come to life, and all I could think of was getting away, putting distance between us and whatever was happening. I heard gunshots behind us, the crack of glass breaking as a stall was shattered, and I could feel the dread creeping up my spine. Then the screams came again. We didn't know where the shots were coming from. We didn't know who was responsible. But the next thing I knew, we were hiding behind a snowbank, trying to catch our breath. The cold cut through my clothes, my skin, but the fear was colder still. My hands shook, my heart raced, and every creak of the snow beneath us made my blood run cold. And then I saw it, the thing that still haunts me to this day. A figure in black, its face obscured by a mask, was standing by the bonfire. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows, but it wasn't the fire that caught my attention. It was what the figure was holding. A knife, a long, serrated blade. The figure moved slowly, methodically, as though savoring the terror that hung in the air. Behind them, I could make out the shape of another body, slumped in the snow, blood pooling around them. The carnival had turned into a massacre. There was no escape. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe. The sounds of gunfire and screaming slowly faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The once bustling carnival was now a ghost town with only the faintest sounds of struggling and the distant crackling of the fire. When the police finally arrived, the damage was already done. Dozens of people were dead, their bodies scattered across the snow. Some had been shot, others had been stabbed, some had been crushed in the panic. The town was left reeling, its citizens in shock. But the most chilling part of the whole thing, no one knew who had done it. The authorities scoured the area, but the masked killers had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The streets were quiet, but the air was thick with fear. No one could understand why something so terrible had happened. And as for the police, they never found the perpetrators. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. I couldn't sleep for weeks after that night. Every shadow, every flicker of light in the corner of my eye made my heart race. I thought I could forget, that time would heal the wounds. But the memory of that night never left me. The town never recovered. The winter carnival was never held again. The town square left empty, the rides and stalls abandoned. But every year, when the snow starts to fall, I can't help but think of that night. The screams, the blood, the figure in black, the winter carnival massacre. And I wonder, were they ever really caught? Or are they still out there, waiting for another chance to strike? As the snow falls this year, I feel it again. The cold, creeping dread. Something tells me that the nightmare isn't over. It's only just begun. The end. Story 10. The Frozen Cult. It was the crackling sound of the ice breaking that first told me something was wrong. At the time, I thought it was just the weight of the snow above, pushing down. But that sound, that piercing, unnatural shatter, came from somewhere deeper, from within the ice itself. And I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. I should have left. I should have turned around when I first saw the strange symbols etched into the trees along the path. But I didn't. I kept walking, a fool in search of answers in a place where there were none. I wish I'd never come here. It all started 3 months ago when I was assigned to cover a routine story for the local paper. The disappearance of a group of hikers in the remote woods of the Adirondack Mountains had been making headlines. The authorities were stumped. No evidence, no bodies, just the sudden vanishing of 5 people without a trace. There were rumors, of course, whispers of a cult living deep in the forest, but no one took them seriously. It was a tragic case of bad weather and bad luck, they said, but I wasn't buying it. As a journalist, I've learned to trust my instincts. Something about the story didn't add up. And so I drove up to the mountains with nothing more than a camera, a notebook, and the conviction that there was more to this than anyone was letting on. The forest greeted me with a silence so profound it felt unnatural. The towering pines stretched high into the sky, their snow-covered branches heavy with frost. Everything seemed still, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I parked my car at the base of the mountain and started hiking, following a trail that led deep into the heart of the forest. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and every step seemed to echo far too loudly in the silence. It was the first night that set the tone. As I set up camp, I noticed the air growing colder, unnaturally cold. It wasn't just the temperature, it felt as though something was pressing in from all sides, an oppressive weight in the air that made it difficult to breathe. I tried to shake off the unease and huddled in my tent, wrapping myself in layers of clothing. The fire outside burned brightly, but it didn't seem to chase away the cold. Around midnight I heard it, the faint sound of chanting. At first I thought it was the wind howling through the trees, or perhaps the distant call of some animal. But then it came again, clear and unmistakable, a low murmur drifting on the wind. My heart began to race as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't English. The words were guttural, ancient-sounding, as if they had been carried through time from some forgotten place. I should have packed up and left that night. But I was stubborn. I told myself that it was just a group of locals, maybe a group of hikers having fun. They'd be gone by morning, I reasoned. But when morning came, they were still there. I packed up my things quickly and headed toward the source of the chanting, my curiosity outweighing my fear. The trees grew denser as I ventured deeper into the woods, and the temperature continued to plummet. My breath hung in the air like mist, and the chill gnawed at my bones. Eventually, I came across a clearing. The sight that greeted me nearly stopped my heart. A group of people, maybe 20, stood in a circle, their faces obscured by thick hoods. The snow around them was stained with something dark, something I didn't want to look at too closely. In the center of the circle was a massive stone altar, its surface slick with frost. And on that altar, there was a body. The chanting grew louder as I stepped closer, my feet crunching in the snow. I froze, suddenly aware of how out of place I was. These people weren't just worshiping. They were performing a ritual, a sacrifice. I recognized the body on the altar, the hikers. They were the ones who had disappeared. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot by a sense of dread so profound it made my chest tighten. The cultists continued their chant, their voices rising in unison, as if calling out to something or someone far beyond this world. It wasn't until the leader of the group raised his arms to the sky that I realized what was happening. His voice was deep, resonant, and filled with power as he shouted words in that ancient tongue. The others followed, their voices swelling in a crescendo of madness. And then, something unnatural happened. The body on the altar, it moved. I watched in horror as the once lifeless corpse twitched and jerked, its eyes snapping open to reveal nothing but empty, hollow sockets. The body rose from the stone as though controlled by some malevolent force. The cultists screamed in triumph, but their joy was short-lived. The corpse turned toward me, its movements stiff and jerky. I stumbled back, panic flooding my system, but my legs were still frozen. The thing's head tilted at an unnatural angle and its mouth opened. Its voice, a garbled whisper, reached my ears. "Leave! Before it's too late." That was all it said, before the leader of the cult screamed in rage, turning toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I knew in that instant that I had been spotted. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "Now you'll join them." I turned and ran. I didn't look back, not even once. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The snow beneath me seemed to swallow my footsteps, the cold air biting at my skin as I sprinted through the woods, knowing that I was being pursued. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I tore out of there, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I sped away from the forest, away from whatever that thing was, away from the cult, and away from the nightmare I had just witnessed. But it wasn't over. As I drove through the night, I began to hear the whispers. At first, they were faint, just a murmur beneath the sound of the wind. But soon they grew louder, surrounding me in a chorus of voices, screaming, chanting, pleading for something. I pressed my foot down harder on the gas, my heart racing as I tried to outrun them. But no matter how fast I drove, they kept coming. When I finally made it back to the town, I went straight to the authorities. But when I told them what I had seen, they dismissed me as a delusional, frightened person who had gotten lost in the woods. The hikers' bodies were never found, and the police claimed there was no evidence of any cult or ritualistic activity. But I know what I saw, and I know that the cult is still out there, waiting in the woods, waiting for anyone who dares to venture too close. The whispers follow me now, even in my sleep. I hear them when I'm alone, in the dead of night, calling me back to the forest, calling me to join them. I don't think I'll ever be free of them, and I'm not sure I want to be. The world outside is freezing, but the worst kind of cold comes from within. That's something I've learned all too well. Something far worse than the chill of the winter winds. Something that keeps you awake, keeps you running, keeps you hunted. And I wonder, as I sit here in the dark, whether any of us truly escape the things we encounter in the woods, or if the forest, and whatever evil lurks within it, will come for us all in time. The end.